So in the last class, we have discussed how firms can hedge against commodity risk. In this class, we will talk about how firms can hedge against exchange rate risk. And we will mainly talk about two methods. The first one is the firm can use currency forward contract to hedge against currency risk. And the second is the firm can use currency options to hedge against currency risks. Okay, first, the definition of exchange rate. So if you have taken a class in macroeconomics, you should have already learned about what is a exchange rate. But if you haven't, well, it's still easy to understand. Exchange rate is essentially a price. So if you understand price, then you can understand exchange rate. Exchange rate is defined as the price at which one currency can be exchanged for another currency. So let's say you look at this, right? USD CAD equals 0.75. So this basically tells you that to exchange for 1 Canadian dollars, you have to pay 75 cents US dollars, right? Or you could say the price of 1 Canadian dollar is 75 cents in United States dollars, right? So this thing is equivalent to say the price of 1 Canadian dollar is 0.75 US dollars, right? So it's easy to understand. Okay, so why exchange rate risk is a concern to firms? Well, the reason is because most exchange rates are floating rates, which means these rates will change depending on supply and demand forces. So let's see 3 examples here. Okay, the first case, firms trading goods. So let's say North Dakota Hydro exchanges USD for CAD to buy power from Manitoba Hydro. So in this case, North Dakota Hydro is an importer, so it needs Canadian dollars to buy power from a Canadian firm. And we understand from our economic courses, price is determined by supply and demand. This is also true for exchange rate because, as I said, exchange rate is essentially a price. So let's say we use supply and demand to understand exchange rate. So let's say the vertical axis gives us the exchange rate. It's essentially the price for Canadian dollars. And then the horizontal axis gives us the quantity of Canadian dollars. And now if the firm North Dakota Hydro exchanges USD for CAD, this basically means it becomes a buyer of Canadian dollars. So the demand curve for Canadian dollars will shift to the right. This basically tells you the exchange rate will increase, or you could say you need more US dollars to buy Canadian dollars, right? Or you could say Canadian dollars appreciates. Okay, the second, investors trading securities. So let's say Canadians exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars to invest in the US stock market. So this is quite natural because US stock market is much larger than Canadian stock market. So a lot of Canadian investors, they would exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars to invest in the US. So in this case, you can see that If Canadians, they exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars, what happens is they will become suppliers, right, of Canadian dollars. That is, the supply for Canadian dollars will increase, right? So this basically means Canadian dollars will depreciate, or you need smaller number of US dollars to buy Canadian dollars. That is, the supply curve will shift to the right and the exchange rate will decrease. Third, the actions of central banks. So let's say Bank of Canada, which is the central bank in Canada. It exchanges Canadian dollars for USD dollars. In this case, it will drive down the value of CAD. The reason is it's just like the second case when we were talking about investors trading securities. If Bank of Canada exchanges CAD for USD, it increases the supply of CAD. So what you will see is the supply curve will shift to the right and the exchange rate will shift from a higher point to this lower point. So the value of CAD will decrease, or you could say CAD will depreciate. Okay, that's the basic economics about how exchange rate is determined by supply and demand. Of course, I am drawing these pictures here just for your understanding, and this is definitely not required. That is, I will not ask you to draw supply curve and demand curve and tell me how exchange rate changes according to supply and demand. So it is not required. Okay, so exchange rate actually changes a lot. So this is a picture for the exchange rate of Canadian dollars. So what you can see is if you look at the peak and trough, right? So at around, I don't know what's the exact time, but I guess it's about 2009. So at about 2008 or 2009, yeah, I guess it's 2008. It should be before the financial crisis. So it's, let's say, around 2009. Sorry, let's say it's about 2008. Canadian dollars was the most valuable, right? You can see that the exchange rate is, I guess it's about 1.08, right? So it's pretty expensive for Canadian dollars. And then we could also look at the trough. So it's after the dot-com bubble, Canadian dollars was worth about 0.63 US dollars, right? So you can see that the difference is huge. It's like 0.63 in 2002, and then the CAD depreciated to 1.08 USD per CAD in 2008. It's a, I don't know, 40%. No, it's more than 40%. It's about 60% increase. So as a firm, if you're a multinational firm, if you're, let's say if you're a Manitoba firm, but if you have business in the US, then you will definitely want to think about how exchange rate will affect your business revenue, right? And then you will think about how you can manage this exchange rate risk. Okay, so this kind of changing exchange rates will cause problem for firms. And we can demonstrate this kind of problem as the importer and exporter dilemma. So let's say there's a Manitoba firm, and this firm imports generators from a supplier in the US. Now, how this transaction is denominated is important here. So first, let's say this transaction is denominated in USD, right? So the price of this generator is denominated in US dollars. Then in this case, the buyer, that is, the Manitoba firm, will face the exchange rate risk, right? Because the Canadian firm has to exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars to buy generators in the US. And if the value of Canadian dollars decreases, then this Manitoba firm will have to use more Canadian dollars to buy US dollars. So this essentially means generators become more expensive for this Manitoba firm, right? So this is the importer's problem. If this transaction is denominated in US dollars. Now let's say we think about the other case. Let's say this transaction is denominated in Canadian dollars. In this case, the Manitoba firm will be happy because there is no exchange rate risk. It will just pay Canadian dollars. But then it will be problematic for this US firm. The reason is because the US firm will receive Canadian dollars. And because it's a US firm, right, it will convert Canadian dollars into US dollars. And if Canadian dollars, its value decreases, then it means this US firm will receive fewer US dollars for its sales, right? So this will pose as a risk to this US firm. So you can see why this is called an importer-exporter dilemma. So basically, no matter how your transaction is denominated in either USD or in CAD, you cannot eliminate this exchange rate risk. At least one firm will have to suffer from this exchange rate risk. Okay, now let's see this example here. It will so we will basically do some simple calculation, and the purpose of this example is it will show you this so-called importer-exporter dilemma. So in March 2009, Whole Foods Market, which is a U.S. Firm, ordered shampoos from a Canadian firm. And when it ordered its product, the exchange rate was 1.3 CAD per USD. So they agreed to a price of $5.2 million. No, it's actually 520,000. Yeah, it's 520,000 Canadian dollars. And this price will be paid in 1 year. Let's say 1 year later, the exchange rate was 1.0251 Canadian dollars per USD. And we have two questions. The first one is, what was the actual cost in USD for Whole Foods Market when the payment was due? So what you can see here is, so in March 29, the price of the products was 52000 Canadian dollars. And we know that the exchange rate was 1.3 Canadian dollars per USD. So this is equal to 400,000 USD, right? At March 29. But then after 1 year, so let's say now it is March 2010, and this is the month Whole Foods would finally pay this 520,000 Canadian dollars to its supplier. And in this case, it will pay this amount of Canadian dollars. However, the exchange rate has changed, right? Now the exchange rate has changed to 1.0251 Canadian dollars per US dollars. So now the amount of US dollars would be 52000 divided by 1.0251, which is so it's 507 507,267.58 USD. Right. So basically what you can see here is Canadian dollars became more valuable after 1 year, right? Because in March 29, per 1 US dollars, you need 1.3 Canadian dollars. And after 1 year, per 1 US dollars, you would only need 1.0251 Canadian dollars. So Canadian dollars has increased its value a lot. And in this case, you can see that because this transaction was denominated in Canadian dollars, and after 1 year, Whole Foods had to pay a much higher price in US dollars, right? I mean, on the surface, it seems that the price is fixed, but it's only fixed in Canadian dollars. After thinking about exchange rate, the price is not fixed in terms of US dollars, right? And because Canadian dollars has increased over the past year, then in the end, Whole Foods, the US firm, had to pay much higher cost. Now, the second question is, if the price had instead been set at 400,000 USD, how many CAD would Avalon, the Canadian firm, have received? So in the second case, this transaction is denominated in US dollars. And what you can see here is, if it's denominated in US dollars, it means after 1 year, this Canadian firm will receive exact 400,000 US dollars. And then it will exchange this 400,000 US dollars into Canadian dollars using this market exchange rate, which is 1.0251, right? So in this case, you can see that the CAD this Canadian firm can get is the amount of US dollars times the market exchange rate after 1 year, right? So in this case, we will get a number which is 410,040. So you can see that this is much smaller compared with the 520,000 Canadian dollars mentioned in the problem, right? So what you can see here is this is precisely this import-export dilemma. In the first case, the transaction was denominated in the US dollars. So, in the first case, the transaction was denominated in Canadian dollars. So in this case, there is no exchange risk for a Canadian firm, but there is exchange rate risk for a US firm. And then in the second case, the transaction is denominated in the US dollars. And in this case, there's no risk for a US firm, but then there is risk for the Canadian firm. Okay, now let's think, how could we solve or how could we eliminate this kind of currency risk, right? So what we can do is, first we will talk about we can hedge against this currency risk using forward contract. And then we will discuss the option contract. That is, we can hedge against the currency risk using a forward contract. So a forward contract is quite similar to the futures contract we mentioned in the last class. If a firm enters into a currency forward contract, then this firm will lock in a exchange rate, and this exchange rate will be fixed in the future. So by fixing this exchange rate, the firm can almost eliminate the currency risk. Just like a futures contract, a currency forward contract has three components. The first is the forward exchange rate, and the second is the amount of currency to exchange, and the third component is the delivery date. Okay, now let's look at this example and see how the currency forward contract works. So in March 2009, banks were offering 1-year currency forward contract with a forward exchange rate of 0.7575 USD per CAD. Suppose that at that time, Whole Foods Market placed this order with this Canadian firm with the price of 520,000 Canadian dollars. And to hedge against this currency risk, Whole Foods at the same time entered into a forward contract to purchase 520,000 Canadian dollars at a forward exchange rate of 0.7575 USD CAD in 1 year. Now the question is, what payment would Whole Foods Market be required to make when the shampoo's shipment took place in 2010? So you can see the difference here compared with the last question, right? In the last question, we didn't mention forward contract, and here Whole Foods, the U.S. firm, entered into this forward contract precisely for the purpose of hedging against the currency risk. You can see that there is currency risk because this transaction is denominated in Canadian dollars, but Whole Foods is a U.S. firm, so it has to think about the currency risk. And now let's answer this question. So you can see that Whole Foods has entered into this forward contract to purchase this amount of Canadian dollars at the future exchange rate. So basically what will happen in 1 year when the payment is due is Whole Foods will exchange US dollars for Canadian dollars according to the contract. And the exchange rate will be fixed, right? In 1 year, the exchange rate will be 0.7575. So basically, we know that Whole Foods will exchange this amount of US dollars for 520,000 Canadian dollars. Now the question is, how do we get this amount? Well, it's pretty simple, right? So we could just use 520,000 times the forward exchange rate. So what is the number here? So it's 393900, right? So it's 393900. So basically you can see that because Whole Foods has entered into this forward contract, and this forward contract has a fixed forward exchange rate. Whole Foods fully understand what will be the exchange rate in 1 year. So by using this forward contract, Whole Foods, this US firm, has completely removed this exchange rate risk, right? Because its payment is fixed in the future. It's always $393,000. Okay. Now, let's look a little deeper in how these currency forward contracts work. So what we just look at it is the case that Whole Foods, a US firm, it can eliminate currency risk by enter into this forward contract. But you might wonder, so Whole Foods has eliminated the currency risk, but where did the currency risk go, right? It cannot go nowhere. The currency risk has to go somewhere. Well, what actually happens is, by entering into this forward contract, the US firm essentially transfers the currency risk to the bank, which writes the forward contract. That is, the bank has sold the forward contract to the US firm. So the US firm enters into this forward contract. The US firm eliminates currency risk, and this risk is transferred to the bank. Now, what will happen is, if you look at this problem here, so the problem says the bank were offering this forward contract. And if you check the numbers, you can see that the bank will suffer from a loss if Canadian dollars increases in value. So we can see this just by this simple calculation. So again, look at this example. It says that in 1 year, Whole Foods will exchange this 393 and 900 US dollars for 520,000 Canadian dollars. So essentially, the bank will receive $393,000, and it will pay Whole Foods 520,000 Canadian dollars, right? And you can see that if the exchange rate increases to 0.9755 USD per CAD. Now, what you can see here is the bank will receive this amount. However, it will have to give 520,000 Canadian dollars to Whole Foods. And the value of these Canadian dollars can be calculated like this, right? So you use 520,000 Canadian dollars times the exchange rate. So you can see that the value of these Canadian dollars would be about 500 US dollars. So what you can see here is after 1 year, right? on the delivery date, Whole Foods will give bank almost 400,000 US dollars, and the bank will give Whole Foods about 520,000 Canadian dollars, whose value is almost 500,000 US dollars, right? So you can see that the bank suffers a loss, and you can see that the loss of the bank is the amount it receives minus the amount it gives out. Of course, both of these two numbers are in US dollars. So it's almost a loss of $100,000, right? Now the question is, why a bank will want to do this? What's the incentive for the bank to bear this huge currency risk, right? Well, the reason is because the bank is not only trading with Whole Foods, it is also trading with other firms. In the end, the bank will serve as a middleman. So what happens is the bank will find another firm which is willing to trade Canadian dollars for US dollars. And the bank will ultimately serve as a middleman. That is, the bank will enter into an offsetting forward contract. And because these two forward contracts, they're offsetting, so the bank can completely eliminate the currency risk. So let's see how this works. This sounds complicated, but you can actually see how this works using this picture, and this picture is very easy to understand. So let's say we have one bank, and then here we have a US firm. So this US firm is a US importer, which means it will buy goods from a Canadian firm, and it will need to pay this Canadian firm Canadian dollars, right? So that's why it needs to pay this Canadian dollars. But then it is a US firm, right? So it wants to hedge against the currency risk. What will happen is it will want to enter a forward contract with the bank, and it will want to exchange US dollars for Canadian dollars, right? So what will happen is, at this part, what will happen is the US importer will pay US dollars to the bank, and the bank will give Canadian dollars to the US importer. And then the US importer can use these Canadian dollars to purchase goods from a Canadian firm. So if you just look at this part, you can see that the bank is bearing a large amount of currency risk. However, the bank can actually enter into a offsetting forward contract. That is this part. So what you can see here is there is a Canadian importer. So this Canadian firm will need US dollars to purchase goods from a US firm. And to hedge against the currency risk, it will enter into a different currency forward contract with the bank. So what will happen is this Canadian dollars will exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars, right? So basically what will happen is the Canadian firm will pay Canadian dollars to the bank, and the bank will give US dollars to this Canadian importer. And then what you can see here is these two contracts, they're offsetting contract, because what you can see here is in this contract, right, the bank will pay out Canadian dollars, right? The bank will pay out Canadian dollars and it will receive US dollars. But if you look at this other offsetting contract, that is this one, then what you can see here is the money received from the US importer, that is the US dollars, will flow directly to this Canadian importer. And the money received from the Canadian dollars, that is this part, will directly flow to the US importer, right? So what you can see here is bank is really serving as a middleman between the Canadian importer and the US importer. And in the end, the bank is not holding any currency. And the bank has no currency risk. Instead, it will earn some profit from charging fees, right? Fees are essentially profits to the bank. Okay. Next, we discuss the pricing of currency forwards. This is actually, if you look at the formula, it looks pretty simple, but it's actually quite confusing. So let's look at this formula here. Now let's assume there is no arbitrage, and in this case, law of one price will hold. So under the assumption of no arbitrage, the forward exchange rate will be determined by the following formula. So we only have like 4 letters here, right? This one is the forward exchange rate. And you can see that this forward exchange rate is how many US dollars in 1 year per 1 Canadian dollars, right? Because we are using USD per 1 CAD. S is today's spot exchange rate. We learned about this. Spot exchange rate essentially means the market exchange rate, right? So S refers to the market exchange rate today. Again, the unit here is USD per CAD. And then our USD is the interest rate in the US. And our CAD is the interest rate in Canada. So put it simple, it's just F equals S times 1 plus interest rate in the US and 1 plus interest rate in Canada, right? However, there's one caveat here. If you look at this formula, you can see that the unit here is USD per 1 CAD, right? Of course, I could use a different unit. I could use CAD per USD, right? So, if I'm using a different unit, then the formula will change. It will look like this. F equals S times 1 plus our CAD divided by 1 plus our USD. Here, the F refers to CAD per 1 USD, and S refers to the spot exchange rate with the unit as CAD per USD. So you have to be really careful with the unit here, right? And you can see that we have this subtle difference. So basically, if the unit is USD per 1 CAD, this case, then the interest rate, the US interest rate should be in the numerator, right? But if the unit changes to CAD per 1 USD, then the interest rate in the US should be in the denominator, right? So I have to emphasize this. You have to be careful with how exchange rate is expressed, right? It's USD per 1 CAD or it's CAD per 1 USD. And then you have to use the correct formula. And this formula is also called covered interest parity. This name is not super important. What I'm trying to say here is it's called covered interest parity because you can see that the forward rate and the spot rate, they're related by the interest rate differentials, right? That is the difference in Canada's interest rate and US's interest rate will be important in determining the forward exchange rate. And if we have multiple years, right? Because for this formula, you're having only 1 year. If you're having multiple years, then the forward exchange rate in year T is given by this. So you can see that it's actually pretty easy to understand. It basically says if you're looking for the forward exchange rate in the next year, then it's F equals S times this thing. But if you're looking for the forward exchange rate in 2 years, then it should be this squared, right? Of course, if you're looking for the forward exchange rate in 3 years, then you would have 3 here, right? Okay, now let's see this very simple example. It's really just a simple application of the covered interest parity. So suppose in December 2018, the spot exchange rate for the Japanese yen is 116 JPY per 1 USD. At the same time, the 1 year exchange rate in the US is 4.85%, and the 1 year exchange rate in Japan is 0.1%. Based on these rates, what is the 1 year forward exchange rate?
Here's what I found.
Okay, let's see how to solve this. So first, what you can see here is it's slightly confusing because when we discussed the formula, we only talked about CAD and USD. But now we are having different currencies, right? We're having Japanese yen. And the formula will be pretty much the same. What you will do is you will use this formula. Because you can see that this formula talks about the forward exchange rate in Canadian dollars per 1 USD. So if you change, right, if you change this into Japanese JPY, then it would be JPY per USD equals the spot rate. Oh, sorry. And JPY per USD times, now you should use Japan's interest rate, in the numerator. And then you will still use the US interest rate in the denominator. So now we could plug in numbers. So F, which is JPY USD equals S JPY USD times 1 plus R JPY 1 plus R USD. Okay, so let's see what kind of numbers do we have here. Okay, so the spot rate is 116, and the interest rate in Japan is 0.1%, and the interest rate in the US is 4.85%. And then let's see what's the answer here. So it's 110.7. So it's 110.7 JPY per USD. Okay. So next we talk about cash and carry. The purpose of talking about cash and carry is we want to examine an alternative way of hedging against currency risk. But more importantly, we want to use cash and carry to understand the formula we just learned about. So instead of using a forward currency contract, a firm can also use a more traditional way, that is cash and carry, to eliminate exchange rate risk. This is called cash and carry because essentially the firm will use the cash to buy the asset today, and then it will carry this asset into the future. So what you will see is cash and carry will provide the same cash flow as the forward contract. So this basically means we can use the cash and carry to replicate the forward contract. And this will help us to understand the covered interest rate parity. Okay, let's see how this cash and carry works. So let's say we have a firm, and this firm wants to exchange CAD for USD. So the firm wants to exchange Canadian dollars to US dollars. The first obvious way to do this is the firm can enter into a forward contract, right? So let's say the firm wants to exchange the CAD into USD in 1 year. Then the firm can just enter into this forward contract and fix this exchange rate and do the exchange in 1 year. And now we want to examine this alternative strategy, that is cash and carry strategy. Now, how the firm can use this cash and carry? Well, there are 3 steps. Step 1. So let's say the firm wants to exchange 1 CAD into USD in 1 year, right? So we just use this number 1, which is it's like the easiest number you can find. Okay, so what the firm will do is it will borrow 1 Canadian dollars, And this 1 Canadian dollar is the par value, which means the firm will have to return this 1 CAD in 1 year. And because the interest rate in Canada is RCAD, so the firm will get this amount. Right? This is the amount of Canadian dollars the firm can actually get. Okay. Step 2. The firm will exchange the Canadian dollars for US dollars. So it will exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars. And because the firm has this amount of Canadian dollars, and let's say the exchange rate is given by S, right? So the firm can get this amount of US dollars. And step 3, the firm will invest this USD. And let's say the interest rate in the US is given by RUSD. Now, after 1 year, the firm will get this amount of US dollars in 1 year, right? So what you can see here is after 1 year, the firm will have this many US dollars, and it will also need to pay back its 1 Canadian dollar debt, right? So what you can see here is essentially the firm is exchanging 1 Canadian dollars for this amount of US dollars, right? So if you simplify this, what you can see here is after 1 year, the firm will have this amount of USD. And this firm will also have to pay back this 1 Canadian dollars. Because we know that in this chart, the firm is borrowing 1 Canadian dollars here, right? So this is equivalent to say that the firm have converted 1 CAD into this amount of USD, right? That is, this amount of USD is equal to the futures, this amount of USD is equal to the forward exchange rate. Okay. Okay, maybe let me make some comments. So there are several comments here in case you get confused. So first, why this is called cash and carry? Because you can see that This part is about cash. You can see that you're using your cash to buy your asset. That is, you're using Canadian dollars to buy US dollars. And the third step is about carry, right? Because you park your Canadian dollars, because you invest your US dollars for 1 year. This is equivalent to say you're carrying your US dollars for 1 year. And then it's also important to note that this cash and carry is a 3-step process, right? And this 3-step process is quite clear in this chart. So this is the step 1. You're borrowing money. Let's say you borrow 1 Canadian dollars. What? Let me use a better color. So this is the step 1, right? So let's say you borrow 1 Canadian dollars. Again, this Canadian dollar is the future value. That is the amount you have to pay back in 1 year. And we know that the interest rate in Canada is given by RCAD. So you have to discount this $1, which means today the money you can get is 1 divided by 1 plus RCAD. And in the second step, you will exchange your Canadian dollars for US dollars. So now you will have S times 1 divided by RCAD. And in the third step, you will invest your US dollars for 1 year. So after 1 year, you will have S times 1 plus R USD divided by 1 plus R CAD, right? So what will happen is you will look at these two numbers. What will happen is in 1 year, you will owe 1 Canadian dollars and you will get this amount of US dollars. So this is equivalent to say in 1 year, you're exchanging 1 Canadian dollars for this amount of US dollars. So this is equivalent to your forward exchange rate, right? So that is this number, and your forward exchange rate has to be the same, right? So that's why this cash and carry strategy can help us to pin down this forward exchange rate. I would say the important point here is you have to understand how this cash and carry method works, right? How to construct this 3-step process. If you don't understand how cash and carry can help us to get this formula, then that's fine. Again, the requirement is you need to know these 3-step process, right? How to construct this cash and carry strategy. It is fine if you don't know how to derive this formula using cash and carry strategy. Okay, so if we can use cash and carry, why do we still need this forward contract? Well, you can see that forward contract is much simpler compared with cash and carry, right? In forward contract, you just need to enter into this contract. It's one transaction. And cash and carry, you need 3 transactions. And in cash and carry, you have a lot of transaction costs, right? You have to think about maybe dealing with different banks. And if you have lower credit rating, then possibly you will have unfavorable interest rate. So in the end, in terms of actual execution, actually hedging against currency risk, forward contract is much simpler and easier to use. Okay, so let's see this problem here. So suppose now it is December 2018 and a Japanese bank enters into a forward contract with the Japanese exporter Shimano, in which Shimano agrees to exchange 100 million USD for JPY in December 2019 at the forward exchange rate of 100.7. If the current exchange rate is 116 and 1 year interest rates are 4.85% in the US and 0.1% in Japan, how can the bank hedge its risk if it has no other firms interested in currency forward contract? So this is an interesting question, right? So it basically says that we have a Japanese firm, Shimano, and this firm wants to exchange 100 million USD for JPY in 1 year. And then there's this fixed forward exchange rate. So basically you can see that in this case, by entering into this forward contract, this Japanese firm can hedge against currency risk. But the problem is the currency risk will be transferred to the bank. And we have learned the bank can only eliminate this currency risk if it can find a offsetting forward contract. And the problem says the bank cannot find another firm who is interested in the offsetting currency forward contract. So basically in this case, you can see that the bank cannot use a offsetting forward contract to hedge against its own currency risk, right? So in this case, the bank can only use the cash and carry method, right? So we will use cash and carry. Now let's think, how could we construct this cash and carry strategy? We know there are 3 steps, right? So if you read this problem, it says that in 1 year, this Japanese exporter will exchange US dollars for Japanese yen. So it basically means that in 1 year, the Japanese bank will receive USD and it will need to pay out Japanese yen, right? So what the Japanese bank wants to do is it will want to make sure it will have enough Japanese yen to pay this Japanese exporter, right? So what the Japanese bank will do is, first, it will borrow it will borrow 100 million US dollars. You might wonder, hey, why this bank wants to borrow US dollars? Why it doesn't want to borrow Japanese yen? Well, the reason is because the bank knows in 1 year it will get 1 million US dollars from the Japanese firm. So in 1 year, the bank will just use the 100 million US dollars it will receive to pay back its debt. Right? So it borrowed this 100 million USD. Now, this 100 million USD is just the face value of the debt. So it will get this amount of US dollars today. So it will get $9,537 million of US dollars today. Second, the bank will use this amount of money to exchange for JPY, right? So exchange USD for JPY. And today's exchange rate is 116. So it will get this amount of JPY. So it should be so it's 11.06 billion JPY. So it's USD, this is JPY. And the third step is the bank will invest JPY for 1 year, right? And you can see that after 1 year, bank will get 11.06 times 1 plus 0.1%. So this will give us 11.7. So what you can see here is by doing this cash and carry, the bank will get the bank will get 11.07 billion JPY in 1 year, right? And in 1 year, it will have this debt due, this 100 million US dollar of debt, it will be due in 1 year. And then you can see that the bank can precisely eliminate the currency risk, because what will happen in 1 year is this Japanese exporter, it will give 100 million US dollars to the bank. So the bank will be able to pay off its debt, right? So it will be able to pay back its debt. And then the bank will have to give 11.07 billion dollars of JPY to the Japanese exporter, right? Because the forward exchange rate is 110.7, right? So the bank will just give this amount to this Japanese exporter, right? So you can see that by using this cash and carry strategy, the bank can successfully eliminate the currency risk. Okay, that's for today's class.